The Independent Audit Committee was established by charter and receives audit reports and other information from the Denver Audit Office. The committee strives to bring greater clarity, transparency, and accountability to Denver's city government and its residents. It is also responsible for commissioning an annual audit of the city's annual comprehensive financial report. This committee is chaired by Auditor Timothy M. O'Brien.
Good morning. I'd like to call the Independent Audit Committee to order for the April 20th, 2023 meeting. Edie, would you be kind enough to call the roll?
Sure. Jack Blumenthal.
Here.
Florine Knapp.
Here.
Leslie Mitchell.
Here.
Rudy Payan.
Here.
Charles Scheib.
Here.
Edward Schultz.
Here.
Timothy O'Brien.
Here. Before we get to the next item, I want to recognize the gentleman to my right, Rudy Payan, has decided to resign from the Audit Committee despite my nagging. And Rudy, I want to thank you, for all your commitment to the Audit Committee over the years. I'm trying to think of how many years you and I have been on this Audit Committee. But thank you for what you've done to, provide accountability and oversight to our government, to the people of Denver. And most of all, I want to thank you for your friendship. It wouldn't be the same, and it won't be the same without you. So if you have a word or two.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. First of all, congratulations on your reelection. So proud. But it has been a thrill. I've served a long time now on the Audit Committee, more than 10 years, and I've enjoyed the experience, and I think that I really believe in the Denver Audit Agency. It's just the best, and I think you do need accountability. And I've always said, in God we trust, all others we audit, and I think it's true. It's just been a pleasure. Tim, Valerie, thank you for your leadership. It's been a pleasure. I'm going to miss you folks. I'm still going to reach out and follow from afar, but I'll always be here.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd entertain a motion to officially recognize Rudy for his excellence over the past 10 years. And we would prepare a certificate accordingly, if that's all right with you.
So
Thank
moved.
you.
So,
Thank you.
second.
Third.
Do I hear a fourth? Okay, anybody object to that kind of a? All right, we'll continue then. Next item is approval of our March 16th meeting minutes. The minutes are in order. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. I know we have a little larger crowd than usual this morning, and I trust it's because of the homeless encampments briefing that we have in front of us. And I appreciate everyone's attendance, and this is an issue that's important to all of us and is of concern to all of us. I do want to mention that this is not like a council committee hearing where public comments are welcomed. We do not take public comments, so appreciate your observing that. And with that, I'm going to ask Dawn to introduce the audit team. Then I'm going to ask Evan Dreyer, if you wouldn't mind coming up to the table to introduce those departments and people that will be participating in the response to the briefing. Evan?
I thought you were going to entertain a motion to adjourn. None of us were going to object to. Also, the airport offered to do this one for us.
How am I supposed to follow that?
Ready?
Ready.
We're missing one. Marley. Now we are ready.
All right. Well, my name is Dawn Wiseman. I was the director on the engagement. Just a quick few words before we get started. Enforcing and responding to homeless encampments is complex, involving multiple agencies, and that is why this audit is important. It's an opportunity to review the associated activities and expenses and provide some insight and recommendations to assist the city with making improvements on providing those services and outreach, tracking expenses, and ensuring equitable treatment of people experiencing homelessness. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Karis, and she's going to introduce her team and get us started on briefing.
Great. Thank you, Dawn. Good morning, auditor and committee members. My name is Kara Sepstein, and I was the manager for the Homeless Encampments audit we're presenting this morning. I'm joined at the table by Sean Wysong, audit manager, Isabel Pupa, lead auditor, Dan O'Connor, senior auditor, and Danielle Edwards, associate auditor. This was a large and complicated audit that involved many different agencies, and I would like to thank the dedicated staff in the mayor's office, city attorney's office, transportation and infrastructure, housing stability, public health and environment, public safety, police department, fire department, parks and recreation, and Denver Human Services for their help and cooperation during this project, but also for the work that you do every day to address homelessness in the city and to respond to the unauthorized encampments.
Karis, let's let Evan, you want to introduce yourself and the people with you?
Yeah, I'll introduce myself, and then I'll let members of the team
Sure.
introduce themselves as well. But first, I would like to echo the congratulations to you on your reelection.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. My name is Evan Dreyer. I am one of Mayor Hancock's deputy chiefs of staff and have served in large part as the coordinator for a lot of the encampment response efforts until the last year when we hired Matt Wilms to serve as the executive in charge of the encampment response program.
And as Evan was saying, my name is Matthew Wilms. I am the unauthorized encampment response program executive. I was brought on in June of 2022 to help coordinate this response.
Laura Brodzinski. I serve as our Chief Housing Officer and Executive Director for the Department of Housing Stability.
Good morning, Nicholas Williams, Department of Transportation Infrastructure, Deputy Manager.
Good morning, Marley Bordowski. I'm the Director of Prosecution, Denver City Attorney's Office.
Okay, thank you. And I know there are other departments represented here. In the event that there's a question, we might ask them to join us at the table. So, Karis?
Okay. Beginning on page 1 of the report, the federal government defines homelessness as a person or family who lacks regular, fixed, and adequate nighttime residence. They may be sheltered and temporarily living in a publicly or privately operated shelter or in another facility such as a hotel. Or they may be unsheltered, living in areas not meant to be lived in, such as a car, a park, or an abandoned building. The sheltered status of a person can and does change quickly and often. Every January, the Denver Metro Homeless Initiative, along with other U.S. cities and counties, conducts a point-in-time count, which is an annual unduplicated count of people experiencing homelessness on a single night. The 2022 point-in-time count for Denver was conducted on January 24th and was the most comprehensive count since 2020. As shown in Figure 1 on page 2, 4,794 people experienced homelessness on this night in 2022. And of those, approximately 27% were unsheltered. Adults over 25 years of age without children made up approximately 76% of the population, and 1 in 3 people were experiencing homelessness for their first time. Many reported having additional conditions or barriers, such as a history of domestic violence or chronic medical and mental health conditions. As shown on Table 1 on page 5, there are 10 different agencies responsible for encampment response. These city departments coordinate to enforce city ordinance and comply with a legal settlement, provide outreach and connections to services for people experiencing homelessness, conduct assessments to identify public health, safety, and environmental risks, and clean up areas with encampments and store people's personal property. As outlined on pages 4 and 5, the city has different ordinances for defining and enforcing rules for encampments. City ordinance says that residing or dwelling temporarily in place with a shelter on public or private property is prohibited unless the person has the property owner's permission. Ordinance also bans people from knowingly blocking streets or other public passageways in ways that make them impassable and hazardous. The city refers to these obstructions as encumbrances. In city parks, ordinance bans people from camping or residing overnight and from constructing either permanent or temporary structures. The fire department also is authorized by the fire code to inspect land, buildings, structures, and other materials for fire and hazards to protect the public and property. Agencies responsible for enforcement are expected to attempt to gain voluntary compliance and connect people with service providers before using enforcement tools. The Department of Public Health and Environment inspects areas with encampments to determine the conditions present, including whether public health, safety, or environmental emergencies exist that require immediate action. Between January 1st, 2022 and June 30th, Public Health and Environment completed 2,223 assessments, including 1,400 of encampments and 711 of recreational vehicles. The city's process to address an encampment starts with outreach, and the outreach teams are sent to help people experiencing homelessness before a cleanup occurs. Page 7 of the report outlines different types of teams providing outreach services that focus on building long-term, consistent, and trusting relationships with service providers. From January 1st, 2022 through June 30th, 2022, these outreach teams went to encampment sites approximately 2,140 times to provide outreach services to people experiencing homelessness. And according to Housing Stability, 3 of these teams alone had 12,664 encounters with people during the same period. The mayor's office uses information from different city departments to decide when to remove large obstructions and clean up areas with encampments. A cleanup may be scheduled for many reasons, such as if it poses a public health hazard or safety risk, it blocks public right-of-way, or it is near sensitive locations such as schools. The city has a contract with Environmental Hazmat Services to dispose of hazardous waste during cleanups and store personal property at a storage facility for people experiencing homelessness. The city is allowed to throw away items that present an immediate risk to the public health and safety, such as used syringes and medical waste. If people cannot take their belongings with them or items are left unattended, the city collects and stores them for at least 60 days, again, as long as they do not present a risk. Staff are required to take care to identify and store things such as wallets, prescription drugs, and personal identification, but are not required to go through backpacks or bags if they pose a health or safety risk. Between January 1st, 2022 and June 30th, the city completed 58 cleanups and canceled 7. As shown, beginning on page 9, in August 2016, the City and County of Denver was sued over an alleged practice of how it cleaned an encampment of multiple people experiencing homelessness by immediately seizing and throwing away property found. The plaintiffs, including Raymond Lyle, argued the city violated people's rights by taking away personal property without due process. This resulted in a settlement agreement in February 2019. The agreement requires the city to adhere to a number of things related to cleanups, personal property, communications, and training. Beginning on page 10, we discuss several of the challenges associated with encampment response. In summary, the affordable housing crisis has made housing and rent unaffordable for many people. Additionally, the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in changes to services and increased unauthorized encampments within the city, which led to further health and safety issues. Larger encampments also can make it harder for providers to connect with people. People struggling with substance misuse and the opioid epidemic have complicated encampment response, and city managers said it can be challenging sometimes to convince people to accept help, and the conditions of living on the street are highly stressful, which could contribute to or worsen mental health conditions. As shown, beginning on page 13, the mayor's office and other city leaders met to discuss strategies to reduce the number of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. This was in response to public health and safety risks created by unauthorized camping and a desire to ensure health and safety for all people in Denver. The group developed the Denver Unauthorized Encampment Response Program, coordinated by the mayor's office, and drafted a program management plan to provide a framework to help city agencies coordinate how they enforce city ordinance and address public health and safety risks. we reviewed the draft plan that was in place as of July 2022. Housing Stability also created a new encampment response team in June 2022 to work with other agencies during cleanups to provide transportation, case management services, and housing connections. Because this team was new and we started the audit, we did not include it in our review of citywide encampment response. As shown on the highlights page, the objective of our audit was to determine the extent the city's current processes for encampment enforcement and providing services are effective, compliant with laws, and equitable, to assess whether the city effectively designed the homeless encampment response program to achieve its mission, goals, and responsibilities, and to evaluate the extent the city is tracking expenses related to encampments and monitoring its contractors. For the scope of the audit, in addition to the compliance and expense tracking documentation and data we reviewed, we reviewed the city's services and communications to determine if the city was providing both equitably to people living in encampments, encampment-related data to see if it was reliable and could be used by the city to conduct meaningful analyses on program effectiveness, and the city's homeless encampment response program and existing processes compared with leading practices and other cities. We included a review of documentation and data from January 1st, 2019 through June 30th, 2022. And at this time, I would like to open the floor for questions and comments from agencies and committee members.
Any questions at this point? Yes, Leslie?
Well, maybe not a quick question. I understand that the scope of this audit ended June 22. There would have been another point in time study census done in January. Generally, what are we seeing? What's the differences from 22 to 23? And I realize that no one may be prepared for that. Maybe you might be. I'm just curious.
I can talk a little bit about the process. So again, I'm Laura Brzezinski with the Department of Housing Stability. So the annual point-in-time count is just that, a point in time generally conducted on a day in January each year in coordination with partners all across the country and here with volunteers and service partners within our Metro Denver Homelessness Initiative that covers the entire region. It generally, after the point in time is conducted on that night in January, there are observation counts as well as surveys that are collected right around that point in time count. And it generally takes about 6 or so months to validate that information, to see all of the numbers and confirm all of the information. So generally for a point in time that's conducted in January, we would usually see the results from that analysis in the summer of that same year. So I would expect a little later this summer to see more clear information after that deduplication process and the validity of the survey is finalized for our 2023 count that was conducted in January of this year.
So at this point, we don't know.
We'll know later this year.
It's too early. A few more months. Okay, thank you.
Would you have a preliminary number?
They do a lot of work to validate those results, so when they come out in the summer, those are the results that are available.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
Let's continue.
All right, thank you. And now Sean will present the first part of finding 1, which has 2 sub-findings.
Thank you, Cars. On page 14 of the audit report, finding 1 states the city lacks sufficient procedures and reliable data to ensure people experiencing homelessness who live in unauthorized encampments are treated equitably and lawfully. This finding contains 2 sub-findings related to Lyle settlement compliance and equitable access to services for people experiencing homelessness. Sub-finding 1, beginning on page 14, states the city is mostly but not fully compliant with the Lyle settlement. First, we found the city complied with several aspects of the settlement and the unauthorized camping ordinance. Specifically, we found all 3 large-scale encampment cleanups we reviewed complied with settlement requirements against throwing away uncontaminated personal property and property storage procedures. All 15 body-worn camera videos of unauthorized camping enforcement we reviewed complied with the ordinance's requirements to provide a verbal warning, determine if the person needs medical assistance or homeless services, and attempt to obtain needed assistance. All 5 notice postings we reviewed complied with settlement requirements for notices to be provided in advance of cleanups and to include information on how and where personal property can be picked up. As noted in the report, we cannot speak to the city's overall compliance with the settlement or ordinance because we were not able to review a representative sample of each event. but we can say we did not identify any noncompliance with the instances reviewed. However, we also found the city did not always comply with settlement requirements for property storage, property disposal, or employee training. Specifically, we found that 2% of 1,069 instances of stored personal property was thrown away before the 60-day storage requirement in the settlement. We also found the dates when staff moved or discarded property were not consistently tracked. Specifically, 53% of those 1,069 instances of property stored were missing a date for when the property was moved to long-term storage, and 4% did not have a date for when property was thrown away. This means neither the city nor Environmental Hazmat Services know for sure that property was held the required amount of time. Additionally, property storage data is missing information on stored property kept by Parks and Recreation, some property identified on Environmental Hazmat Services inventory logs, and property we observed being stored in body-worn camera footage. These issues occurred because neither Transportation Infrastructure nor Environmental Hazmat Services has documented policies and procedures for property storage, disposal, or monitoring property storage data. Staff from both shared inconsistent understandings of which is responsible for disposing of personal property. We also found that Transportation Infrastructure and Environmental Hazmat Services staff threw away and stored unattended personal property at one of 2 reviewed daily trash cleanups without providing the settlement-required 48-hour notice. While police officers did ask people living nearby if the owner of an unattended tent was present, no written 48-hour notice was seen posted in the camera footage. Transportation Infrastructure does not provide advance notice of its daily trash cleanups and does not have policies and procedures for unattended personal property during daily cleanups. City Attorney's Office staff said there are times notices are posted and then removed, and staff could have posted the notice even though it was not shown in the video. We also found the city's property storage webpage used to notify the public when unattended personal property has been removed and stored by the city did not contain all settlement required information. Specifically, the webpage did not include a phone number for people to call with questions. By comparison, both the city's 48-hour and 7-day large encampment cleanup notices inform people to call Denver 311 with questions on property storage and retrieval. As a result, people experiencing homelessness may not know who to call about stored personal property. Table 2 on page 21 of the report shows that Denver 311 received only 63 calls inquiring about stored personal property between January 1st, 2019 and June 30th, 2022. The webpage also listed the wrong address for the storage facility as of July 2022. Rather than the 1449 Galapagos Street address for the city's property storage facility, the Department of Housing Stability mistakenly listed the address of a local nonprofit's separate storage facility. The mayor's office said the incorrect address was displayed from June to August 2022 before being corrected. And while the city and county of Denver was... Oh, I missed it. Yep. Lastly, we found one employee in the Department of Transportation Infrastructure did not take settlement-required homeless sensitivity training in 2021 because the department is not monitoring its training records to verify staff compliance. Additionally, neither Transportation Infrastructure nor the Department of Parks and Recreation were able to provide attendance records to show employees had taken other required trainings, such as those related to hazardous materials or trauma. While the city and county of Denver was generally compliant with the Lyle settlement, these instances of noncompliance exposed the city to potential future liabilities and lawsuits. Additionally, people experiencing homelessness may not be able to retrieve their belongings if they are thrown away before the 60-day minimum storage requirement, and they may not have the information they need to know how to retrieve their belongings if the city's website does not contain a phone number to call for information. Therefore, we make the following 9 recommendations beginning on page 23 of the report. I will read all recommendations before pausing for comments and questions. In recommendation 1.1, we recommend the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure should establish and document roles and responsibilities for evaluating and disposing of property collected and stored in the city storage facility. Recommendation 1.2 says Transportation and Infrastructure should work with its contractor to develop policies and procedures for ensuring compliance with the Lyle settlement regarding property storage and disposal. The department has agreed with these recommendations with an expected implementation date of June 30th, 2023. Recommendations 1.3 and 1.4 state transportation and infrastructure should work with its contractor to develop policies and procedures for inputting, tracking, and monitoring property storage data and should periodically monitor this data. The department has agreed with these recommendations with an expected implementation date of June 30th, 2023. Recommendation 1.5 from page 24 of the report says transportation and infrastructure should develop policies and procedures to provide the required 48 hours notice for unattended personal property found at its regular citywide cleanups in compliance with the Lyle settlement. The department has agreed with this recommendation with an expected implementation date of June 30th, 2023. Recommendations 1.6 and 1.7 state the Denver Unauthorized Encampment Response Program should work with all agencies responsible for homeless encampment cleanup and response to develop and document policies and procedures for monitoring and ensuring staff complete required trainings, including those required by the Lyle settlement. The city has agreed with these recommendations with an expected implementation date of July 31st, 2023. Recommendation 1.8 states the program should work with city agencies responsible for providing and monitoring training to ensure compliance with the city's record retention policy related to preserving training documentation. The city has agreed with this recommendation with an expected implementation date of July 31st, 2023. And lastly, recommendation 1.9 on page 25 of the report states the city attorney's office should work with responsible agencies to ensure the city's website contains, at a minimum, all information required by the Lyle settlement and that the information is accurate so people experiencing homelessness can be easily informed of where and how to retrieve their personal belongings. The city attorney's office has agreed with this recommendation and reports it was implemented on April 3rd, 2023. I would now like to open the floor for any questions or comments from agencies or audit committee members.
So could I ask for 1.1 through 1.4, the Department of Transportation to make any additional comments? And thank you for agreeing to all the recommendations. So.
Certainly. Yeah, no, I mean, this, again, Nicholas Williams, Department of Transportation Infrastructure, Deputy Manager on there. And I think, yeah, our responses show that while we are confident in how we are conducting this business, and it's a very important business when we're dealing with folks' belongings and how our discipline on how we approach these encampment cleanups, policy and that additional structure, we think that's completely appropriate and certainly are working on that.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee on the first four?
I have a question really quickly. How many people do you have working to ensure that they're properly recording inventory of the folks in the Department of Transportation? How many folks do you currently have working on that issue specifically or about?
Okay. 5 total, including...
Is that sufficient in your opinion?
You know, I think when we get these documents in, I do think we can manage that effectively on there, and we'll see how that goes and make adjustments as necessary. But I think with the proper structure in there, I do think it's appropriate.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Evan, 5 through 8 are regarding the response program. Do you want to make any additional comments?
Well, I think I would say in general, mostly compliant as opposed to mostly not compliant is, I think, for us, the most important point. This is a new program, and we created the program because we recognized the need for formality and intentionality around it. We did agree with the recommendations, many of which we have already implemented and will be implementing in order to improve the operation to the level of care that this work requires.
Okay. Thank you. Florine?
I was just curious, maybe you could give a little more color around how it's determined when an encampment is going to be addressed for cleanup.
Absolutely, I can help clear that up. So there are multiple facets to how that's determined, and it really starts with input from all of our city agencies. Sorry, let me reintroduce myself to you. This is my first audit. So my name is Matthew Williams. I'm the Unauthorized Encampment Response Program Executive within the Mayor's Office. So we have stand-up daily meetings with all the agencies involved, and what we do is we take a look at our DDPHE public health and safety assessments, and those include anything from documenting those exact same things. So improperly disposed sharps, trash and debris accumulation, right-of-way obstruction, propane, fire hazards. They collect a lot of that data, and then that's provided to the group as well. We also work with our DPD and DFD agency representatives to gather that information on these specific locations as well, and locations of concern. And then we also work with our partners at Audit to determine the encumbrance level and things of right-of-way impediment from those agencies as well. Within all those, we take those to the discussion and then currently determine which of those locations are the highest priority to clear, due to that risk to not just the people inside the encampment, but the people outside of it as well. And so through that discussion, that's how the determination is made, and the severity of those criteria that are identified.
Thank you. Are you typically made aware, initially made aware of unauthorized encampments by neighborhood people calling? Is that typically how that, or is there some programmatic drive-by of all the streets?
It's a combination of a lot of that. Primarily, it is complaints. We receive anywhere from 100 to 120 311s and Salesforce cases a day. And we have multiple agencies, including HOST, the Department of Safety, and myself that go through those. So that's one of the ways that we find it, but also we have our agencies that are out in the field and making those identifications as well.
Thank you.
Jack?
Just out of curiosity, how many encampments do you have to do something with on average on a daily or weekly basis, just to give some idea of the, what's going on out there on the street? And I know it's an estimate, so it's, please.
May I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
Are you looking for like the large-scale encumbrance removals, so our larger cleanups, or daily interaction, just sites day by day?
Really, the relocations as opposed to, I'm sure there are tons of interactions, but just, just to give us some perspective, that's all I'm.
Absolutely. So our large scale encumbrance removals, so those are the larger cleanups that a lot of this looks at. Those typically are about 2 to 3 a week, depending on the need. We've had weeks where it's as low as 1, and we've had weeks where it's 0.
Thank you.
And as a reminder, you asked about the point-in-time count, and you mentioned the number, but 1,313 people living unsheltered on the streets of Denver as of the last point-in-time count. 1,313 living outside.
Okay. Recommendation 1.9, would the city attorney want to respond?
I think I may still be able to take that one, if you're comfortable. So the recommendation did cite that the city attorney would work with us to make sure that that is in compliance and applicable, and they do support us with that. HOST currently manages that website, and so we go through our friends at HOST to make sure that that gets updated properly. So I did make the request to make sure that the 311 number was added to the website, which it was on April 3rd. We will continue to make sure that that website stays current and consistent with any of the verbiage and language that we need it to. So we will be working with our city attorneys to make sure that that is compliant. But myself and our communications folks at HOST will be maintaining that website.
Thank you. Should we continue?
Our second subfinding of finding 1 begins on page 25 of the report. It says the city cannot ensure equitable access to services or stored personal belongings for people experiencing homelessness. During our audit, the city had 6 main teams providing outreach. We requested data from each team between January 1st, 2022 and June 30th, 2022, and we received data for 5 of the teams. While the city appears to provide access to services and equally conducts its assessments and cleanups across Denver, its data was unreliable. Specifically, we found issues with data consistency, missing data, and inaccurate locations across the teams. As shown in Figure 4 on page 28, we mapped this data and determined that during the 6-month period, the 5 teams had visited at least 1,200 unique active encampment sites throughout Denver County. The locations show that the teams visited encampments to provide outreach and connections to services across the city and were not focused in just one area. We also found that the city provided more outreach and services than there were cleanups. Specifically, while there were cleanups at 74 encampment locations between January 1st, 2022 and June 30th, 2022, the outreach teams provided services, again, to those at least 1,200 unique encampment sites during this time. The maps showing assessments, encampment sites, and complaints are shown in Appendix B, beginning on page 84. Still, like the outreach data, there were locations in the cleanups, assessments, and complaints data that we could not identify. Further, the cleanups and assessments addresses were not standardized. The data was manually entered, and several departments lacked policies and procedures for data input, tracking, and monitoring. We also looked at the Denver Park Rangers data from the same time period. Unlike the other data, the park rangers used an application to track specific coordinates where there were encampments or cleanups in the parks. While these coordinates helped more accurately identify encampment activity, the data still contains some errors, such as blank values and incorrect dates. However, most encampment response teams, including Denver Parks and Recreation, intend to move to a centralized database this year. During our audit, we also looked at equitable access to property storage. Since 2018, the city's main property storage facility has been located at 1449 Galapagos Street. As specified in the settlement agreement, the storage facility is open for 2.5 hours, 4 days a week, from 6 to 8:30 a.m., and for 6 hours on Thursdays, from noon to 6 p.m. The settlement requires the city to store personal property for at least 60 days. The city's practice is to keep the property in the main storage facility on Galapagos Street for 30 days before transferring it to a separate long-term storage facility not available to the public for the remaining 30 days. We reviewed environmental hazmat services records and found that between January 1st, 2019 and June 30th, 2022, there were 13% of 1,069 instances in which property was moved to the long-term storage facility before those 30 days that are communicated in notices to people at encampment sites. Staff said this was due to storage limitations as well as the city's garbage truck service dates. As shown in Figure 5 on page 35, we also found that the Galapagos Street storage facility is not near many encampment sites, and people experiencing homelessness may not have access to transportation to get to the storage facility. Our analysis of homeless encampment cleanup data showed the average distance to the storage facility from encampment cleanup sites was over 2 miles, and the maximum distance between an encampment cleanup site and the storage facility was just over 13 miles. We also found that only 8.7% of 1,673 tagged personal property stored at the facility was picked up from January 1st, 2019 and June 30th, 2022. Environmental hazmat services staff said the short and early facility hours, along with limited access to transportation, may prevent people experiencing homelessness from retrieving their belongings. The city is compliant with the requirements on property storage hours as listed in the settlement. Still, the city did not conduct a formal needs assessment to determine the best location for the facility. The last area of equitable access that we looked at are with the city's communication practices. While compliant with the settlement, the city's practices for communicating with people experiencing homelessness may not provide equal access to information about services or retrieving their personal belongings. Specifically, the city does not have a documented process to communicate with people experiencing homelessness who speak a language other than English or who have a disability. Written notices about cleanups are provided only in English to people at encampment sites before a 7-day or 48-hour notice, or cleanup, Some city agencies rely on bilingual staff or the city's translation services to communicate in these situations. However, there are no formalized processes to guide the city employees to effectively communicate with all people experiencing homelessness. We have 10 recommendations for sub-finding 2 of finding 1. I will read all 10 before pausing to allow for questions and comments from the agencies and audit committee members. On page 41, recommendations 1.10 and 1.11 state the Denver Unauthorized Encampment Response Program should continue developing a centralized database for the encampment response teams to provide consistent and centralized data tracking at the encampment sites, and they should work with the agencies to identify and adopt a consistent method for tracking location data, such as using latitude and longitude coordinates. The city agreed with these recommendations with an implementation date of December 31st, 2023. On page 42, recommendations 1.12 and 1.13 state the program should develop policies and procedures for data input, tracking, and monitoring for outreach data, and they should periodically monitor this data to ensure accuracy and identify trends. The city agreed with these recommendations with an implementation date of December 31st, 2023. Recommendations 1.14 and 1.15 state the program should develop policies and procedures for data input, tracking, and monitoring of its cleanups and assessments data, and should periodically monitor this data to ensure accuracy. The city agreed with these recommendations with an implementation date of December 31st, 2023. Recommendation 1.16 on page 43 states the program should conduct a needs assessment to determine the most appropriate locations and hours for the property storage facilities, and should consider transportation needs and options as part of this assessment. The city agreed with this recommendation with an implementation date of April 1st, 2024. Recommendation 1.17 states the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure should work with its contractor to document the process for when property can be moved from the main storage facility to long-term storage. The agency agreed with this recommendation with an implementation date of June 30th, 2023. Recommendation 1.18 states the city should go above and beyond the settlement's requirements and provide information related to cleanups and property storage equitably to people who have limited English proficiency or who have a disability. The city agreed with this recommendation with an implementation date of December 31st, 2023. And finally, recommendation 1.19 states the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure should work with the city attorney's office to revise notices at encampment sites to clearly state how long properties will be kept at both the main storage facility and the long-term storage. Notices should clarify that a person may have to visit the main storage facility more than once to retrieve their belongings that were held off-site. The agency agreed with this recommendation with an implementation date of today, April 20th, 2023. I now would like to open the floor for any questions or comments from the agencies and audit committee members.
Matthew, I think these kind of fall in your lap. Would you like to respond further?
Absolutely, and you'll see my name through a lot of the the audit as we get to the way that I will be supporting a lot of the agencies through this. And while my name is associated with being responsible, because I will be making sure these things do occur, I'm really going to be supporting these efforts through our agencies and making sure that we are all aligned to make sure that we not only just comply with this, but that we make sure that we get to a point where, you know, we are tracking our data accurately and we're making sure that things are, I guess, more formally tracked. We have a lot of this information, as is stated, and it's just making sure that we bring it all together and make the language that we all speak consistent. A lot of that's going to be done with our app, Nav app, and that hopefully will be launching here in the next few months. We are at the mercy of a contractor to put that together, so as they have hiccups, that does push our timeline out a little bit. But what that app does is it provides a centralized location for all of our agencies that are involved in this response to input, receive, and make sure that that data that's provided is done in a consistent message, a consistent method, and as well as making sure the teams have access to all of that information as well. A couple of these recommendations are things like formalizing location data, and NavApp will convert all of that information into latitude and longitude. That includes the locations that come in on the complaints as well. So there won't be a manual entry of there. It'll be created at that latitude and longitude for teams to be able to see. And then as far as cleanup data and outreach data for our teams that perform outreach, there are some limitations to, limitations aren't the requirements for how outreach data is tracked for our outreach teams, and Laura can speak to some of that. But for our teams that are primarily included in enforcement, but they also do outreach activities, those will be recorded within NavApp as well. So a lot of those recommendations there as far as the data piece goes are going to be greatly addressed when NavApp rolls out.
Thank you. Rudy?
I have a question regarding the coordination. I think it's very difficult to try to coordinate efforts between agencies or among agencies and trying to achieve or instill quality control procedures, which I think we're all striving for in order to collect and properly record the data. But my question also has to do with the storage. What kind of challenges do you have in terms of short-term versus long-term storage? Because after a while, you run out of storage and you got to keep things moving. So how does the city address that particular issue?
Thank you. Again, Nicholas Williams, Department of Transportation Infrastructure. Yeah, I mean, it is a challenge, certainly, on that. And I think that's why you see kind of the evolution of how we have conducted the storage, how we have had both short-term and long-term on there. And do think with this recommendation and the needs assessment, we'll be able to better refine that and better kind of meet the needs of the folks that have stuff stored there.
Thank you.
Okay. Other questions from the committee? You know, the Lyle settlement seems to be a driving force behind what we're doing, what the city's doing. And to me, that's kind of a base level of the way this should operate so that we're not violating people's civil rights. Are there plans within the response program to go above and beyond? I mean, these are a very vulnerable population in Denver, especially the 1,313 that are living on the streets.
I think throughout this audit, and as well as the policies and procedures and processes that we do have, you see that the city strives to not only just meet the requirements of the Lyle settlement, but to meet and exceed the needs of the people on the streets. And Laura can definitely do a much better job of talking about a lot of what we do there. But I do just want to be clear that, yes, the program not only is just to be here to be in compliance with the Lyle settlement, but to make sure that we are taking care of the people on the streets as well.
Sure, Laura Brzezinski with Department of Housing Stability. I'll give a little bit more of an understanding of the suite of some of the different services that are provided and some of our different focus. One of the things that's talked about here as far as a host resource is some of our outreach services. Those are provided in part via direct personnel within the department to provide really that housing-focused outreach support, navigation across different resources in connection to housing. We also have partners like the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless and other resource providers that are contractors for outreach services. But broader than outreach, we have a wide array of different supports that we provide for people experiencing homelessness, those that are sheltered as well as experiencing unsheltered homelessness. Housing is the solution. So we really focus our efforts on engaging and creating a pipeline of affordable and supportive housing as well as programmatic assistance that helps to resolve an experience of homelessness. Evan said earlier we have nearly 15,000 people who have been connected from homelessness to housing over the tenure of the Hancock administration. So that is really our focus. But other services and supports, particularly for those who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness, in addition addition to outreach, we really have focused on expanding our tools for shelter alternatives in addition to shelter. So things like safe outdoor spaces, safe parking programs, again, with the focus on connecting people to the housing solution that can help end an experience of homelessness. We have some really important investments this year that we are expanding as our tools for support for especially those who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. There are models used in other communities like Houston for encampment resolution, where an investment into significant outreach to connect to bridge navigation units to then exit to a housing solution can help really focus on serving those who may be currently residing in an encampment to get connected to that housing intervention. So we have resources over $40 million this year with our ARPA one-time federal funds to help support acquisition of hotels or other like properties that can help support implementation of that model alongside additional outreach services. So if you have any particular questions about some of those interventions, just let me know. But those are some of the wider context around the agency's efforts to resolve experiences of homelessness.
If I may.
Sure.
Just to underscore, I guess, your question, do we plan to go above and beyond? And the last point that Laura was just making. Yes. Everything that we are doing is geared to reduce the number of people that are living in encampments. This last effort that Laura just mentioned, encampment resolution, by moving communities of encampments, moving people who are living in encampments into temporary housing at first and then permanent housing together, so they move as a community, and then an encampment is cleaned and closed. I think that will be the gold standard for Denver, and trying to adopt and adapt that best practice from other cities around the country is a big focus of what we budgeted for this year.
Thank you. Laura, can I ask a specific question about, there's a motel, a former motel at I-25 and Colorado Boulevard, where there's a fence around it and there are some encampments now outside the fence. Is that on your target list to purchase?
I can certainly follow up with you to understand a little bit more about the specific location that you are referring to connect as part of the pipeline of our team. But we are currently working with the real estate department to work on the pipeline of those acquisitions and actually have an active procurement for partners to come forward and identify qualifications to be part of that acquisition pipeline. But I'd be happy to follow up and learn a little bit more about the specific
It's
location.
Colorado and Bucktail.
Thank you.
The former La Quinta, yeah. Okay, thanks. Let's continue.
All right, thank you, Isabel, and good morning, everyone. Finding 2 begins on page 45 of the report and says that the city is not tracking expenses related to homeless encampments or sufficiently monitoring invoices and contract performance. This finding has 2 sub-findings. Subfinding 1 of finding 2 says that the city does not have a formal process to track costs for homeless encampment efforts. Because the city does not track how much it spends on homeless encampments, we wanted to quantify that amount ourselves. To do so, we requested details and documentation from the 10 agencies related to costs for enforcement, outreach, and cleanup efforts from January 2019 through June 2022. Those costs included expenses related to personnel, contractors, equipment, information systems, and any additional expenses that the agencies determined were relevant. The 10 agencies provided a combined total of $13.65 million worth of self-reported expenses, which we then categorized among enforcement, outreach, and cleanup costs based on our understanding of how each agency's efforts fit into the larger picture of encampment response. However, due to limitations in the agency's self-reported data, the breakdown in Figure 6 on page 47 may not be accurate. While we did not find any citywide or agency-specific guidance on what expenses that relate to encampment response efforts should be tracked, we were told that challenges exist which hinder an agency's ability to track those expenses and impacted our ability to provide assurance over the accuracy or completeness of the total. First, staff in some agencies provide services such as outreach to any person experiencing homelessness, not just those living in encampments. Further, despite the city's efforts to prevent this, some people experiencing homelessness can be both sheltered and unsheltered during a given day, which complicates expense tracking efforts. Additionally, emergency services agencies such as the fire and police departments do not track their calls related to encampments separately from other calls, and park rangers do not track their time or expenses based on the type of enforcement performed. Also, only 4 of the 10 agencies provided us with expenses for the entire requested time period, and only 1 agency provided third-party documentation, such as invoices, to support its self-reported expenses. Regardless, federal guidance says that cities should define the scope of a cost estimate, record activities involved in responding to encampments, gather costs from stakeholders, and analyze the cost data. In our research of other cities like Denver, we learned that Seattle, Portland, Oregon, and Chicago have implemented procedures for tracking encampment-related expenses. We also learned that Denver uses specific tags within its financial system, Workday, for other multi-agency programs and efforts, but those tags are not used for encampment-related expenses. By not tracking encampment-related expenses, the city cannot ensure that its spending is efficient and effective, or that it is meeting goals of the unauthorized encampment response program. The city also cannot compare encampment-related expenses with those for other homelessness initiatives, or offer transparency with residents about how it spends money on responding to encampments. We have 3 recommendations for subfinding 1 of finding 2. Recommendations 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3 on page 49 state the Denver Unauthorized Encampment Response Program should work with city agencies to determine how encampment response expenses should be calculated, which expenses should be included, to develop a method for tracking those expenses, and to document policies and procedures to ensure consistency across city agencies. The city agreed with all 3 recommendations with an implementation date of December 31st, 2023. I'll pause here before moving on to the next subfinding for questions and comments.
Any questions on this subfinding recommendations? Any comments from the program?
I would say we can do a better job of tracking expenses. We probably could have done a better job responding to the request for information for this audit. I will say that the proportion of dollars spent on outreach, enforcement, and cleanups is right, and probably wouldn't change even if the dollar amount changes. The fact that we are spending almost 2/3 of resources as analyzed in this audit on outreach is a positive, a very positive. Even if the amount changes a bit, the total dollar, when you compare that to the $250 million that we are spending this year to reduce homelessness, to prevent homelessness, and to increase affordable housing, that seems like the right balance to me.
Thank you. Dan?
Thank you. Subfinding 2 of finding 2 begins on page 49 of the report and says that the city insufficiently monitors contractors who provide services related to homeless encampment response. The city has contractors to perform services to assist with responding to encampments. However, we found that city agencies are not adequately overseeing the approval and payment of invoices. And further, while some agencies do provide sufficient oversight of the performance of those contractors, others do not. We reviewed invoice payments and monitoring efforts for 3 contracts based on their level of risk. We looked at dollar amounts, previously identified issues, and presence of policies and procedures for contract monitoring. Specifically, we looked at 1 contract for hazardous waste cleanup and the operation of the city's storage facility, another for the performance of outreach services to people experiencing homelessness, and a third to provide various barricades and traffic control devices during encampment cleanups. Across those 3 contracts, we found generally insufficient contract monitoring processes, which led to issues related to invoice timing, the contents and accuracy of invoices, which sometimes resulted in overpayments by the city, the approval of erroneous invoices, a lack of supporting documentation, and overbilling for services, some of which were not received. Without adequate oversight of the invoice process, the city risks overpaying for services, paying for services it does not receive, and paying for services and expenses that are not allowed by a given contract. Further, the city cannot ensure that it is spending money on encampment efforts efficiently and effectively. And without sufficient policies and procedures related to contract monitoring, the city cannot ensure that contract terms are being met or track program outcomes and determine the quality of services being provided. We have 6 recommendations for subfinding 2 of finding 2. I will read all 6 before pausing to allow for questions and comments from the agencies and audit committee members. On page 55 of the report, recommendations 2.4 and 2.5 state the Denver Unauthorized Encampment and Response Program should work with agencies to identify a person within each agency to be responsible for reviewing and approving invoice payments and should create policies and procedures for the invoice approval process. The city agreed with these recommendations with an implementation date of December 31st, 2023. Recommendations 2.6 and 2.7 state the program should work with agencies to identify a person within each agency to monitor contractor and master purchase order compliance and performance for encampment-related contracts and should create policies and procedures for this process. The city agreed with these recommendations with an implementation date of December 31st, 2023. Recommendation 2.8 states that city agencies responsible for invoice payment and contract monitoring should comply with the city's records retention policy related to invoice supporting documentation. The agencies agreed with this recommendation with an implementation date of December 31st, 2023. And recommendation 2.9 states the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure and the Department of Public Health and Environment should identify and implement a method to ensure that adequate security services are provided during all hours the property storage facility is open to the public in accordance with the Environmental Hazmat Services contract. The agencies agreed with the recommendation and said it had been implemented as of March 1st, 2023. I'd like to open up the floor for any questions or comments from the agencies and audit committee members.
Any questions from the committee?
I have one.
Rudy?
How does Mr. Williams, how would you go about in terms of identifying expenses straight across all the agencies and get an agreement on that? Because one of the recommendations, identify the expenses to track. So what would be your methodology in terms of identifying the expenses agency across the city?
Well, as far as the program involvement with this is, I'm going to be working with all the agencies to make sure that's happening, and that includes the budget management office and really just all of the heads of the agencies that are going to be covering this. So my role in this specifically is just going to be making sure that it continues to move forward and that we get these things in place.
Now, would that end in like in a memo of understanding among the agencies that you're working with? I mean, in order to identify and track these expenses? That's where I'm getting at mostly.
I mean, we'll make sure that these policies and procedures are formally documented. I don't know if a memorandum of understanding is the appropriate measure because I'm not 100% familiar with those.
I'm just throwing that out.
But yes, these will be formally documented.
Yeah, that's my biggest concern is that's where the gaps, when you do a gap analysis in terms of the agencies, when it breaks down, it's a failure of the agencies to identify those expenses up front and then track them afterwards. That's where I was going with this line of questioning. Thank you.
And if I just may add to Matt's comments, I think he hit what I was going to hit on there. And yeah, MOU, service level agreements is relatively common between the agencies, and likely that would be the vehicle that we use to define this. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. That was my ignorance.
So I will repeat what we talked about, Evan, across the hall earlier this week, but I just think the program needs a lot more structure to it, where it would have a budget, and a budget makes it pretty easy to track expenses. And some of that budget would come from the various departments that are represented here. But that way you're able to fix responsibility with an individual. You have goals and objectives that you monitor, that you adjust, with the information that you collect. Monitoring contracts would be fixed with one department or one office. And tracking the outcomes. I mean, I think all the things that go on in other departments, agencies, and offices, really, this program warrants it. And that's what I'm here for, is to tell you that. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, this is a brand new program. And Nick used the phrase evolution. I would also say iterative. We, as a city, were doing this work in an informal fashion, trying to coordinate it as much as possible. this program is an acknowledgement of the need for formality. And as a program matures, I think some of the things that you're pointing out will occur anyway.
Well, I contrast it to the, when the marijuana, which we'll be all celebrating this afternoon, I guess. When that initiative passed, the mayor created an Office of Marijuana Policy, I think it was, that grabbed hold of that issue. I think it was a very successful implementation of how that industry is regulated and enforced. I think this warrants, this kind of care also. And then when the marijuana seemed to be up and running appropriately, they folded it into a different department. And maybe this could follow the same model.
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously there's a difference between regulating an industry like marijuana and trying to address the extremely complicated and complex needs of human beings.
I totally agree. That's why I think it would be appropriate to have its own department, so to speak. Danielle, are you next?
Thank you, and good morning. Finding 3, the city's draft program management plan needs improvements to effectively guide city agencies in their unauthorized encampment responsibilities and begins on page 57 of the report. The mayor's office and a group of city leaders created a draft program management plan for the Denver Unauthorized Encampment Response Program in March 2021. The plan is meant to assist city agencies in activities related to unauthorized encampments by ensuring all agencies are well coordinated and meet legal requirements and obligations. The city's draft plan aligns with some elements of leading practice for program design. For example, the draft plan says meetings and communication to coordinate and share information should happen regularly among city agencies involved in encampment response. The mayor's office and several other city agencies involved in responding to homeless encampments meet twice a day to discuss outreach and engagement with enforcement teams and to identify and prioritize efforts in certain locations. Additionally, the mayor's office managers said a group made up of people experiencing homelessness and their representatives meet quarterly to discuss the needs of people experiencing homelessness and address concerns. However, areas for improvement include the following. Beginning on page 58, city leaders from the mayor's office say the draft program management plan will never be finalized. It will always be a living document and is expected to develop over time. Leading practices say once a program plan is set, it is important for managers to resist making continual changes. Effective evaluation needs several years of data to show patterns of success. Continual revisions and changes restarts the clock on evaluations and delays outcomes. Managers in the mayor's office said that while the program was designed with input from stakeholders, the city did not conduct a formal assessment or situational analysis to identify program needs. Managers met with the advisory group and staff who had previous experience in similar work to identify risks. However, without a formal needs assessment, the program will not benefit from an all-encompassing and documented review of what is needed from multiple perspectives. As outlined in page 60, while the draft program management plan outlines goals and objectives, most did not include a timeline for when these goals should be met or have defined metrics for measuring success. Additionally, there was no time frame for evaluating the program or target dates for when goals should be achieved. Without performance metrics or monitoring tools, managers cannot make sure the program is successful in meeting its goals to reduce the number of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness and respond to health and safety risks. Managers in the mayor's office say these will be developed and documented in the future. On page 62, policies and procedures and clearly defined responsibilities for some agencies and teams, such as those providing enforcement and outreach, were not included in the July 2022 version of the draft program management plan that we reviewed. The plan did, however, include some policies and procedures for the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure and Parks and Recreation. On page 63, unauthorized encampment response program managers said policies and procedures and responsibilities for enforcement and for some outreach teams were not included in the draft plan because their responsibilities were not yet set. They said this would be documented in the next version of the draft plan. Lacking documented policies and procedures which clearly define responsibilities means staff may not successfully perform daily tasks, potentially leading to an ineffective program, and the city risks losing knowledge when key staff members leave the city. City staff responsible for conducting assessments and prioritizing cleanups say they use public health, environmental, and public safety data to prioritize cleanups, but this criteria is not documented in the program management plan and is still being developed. When comparing Denver to similar cities we researched, we found 85% have documented processes for prioritizing cleanup visits or cleanups. For example, Portland, Oregon conducts assessments on a first-come, first-served basis, but it prioritizes cleanups based on risk levels. Categories are weighed based on high or low priority. If Denver does not have a defined criteria for prioritizing cleanups, it cannot ensure cleanups are being completed in an equitable manner based on risks. We have 7 recommendations for finding 3. I will read all 7 recommendations before pausing to allow for questions and comments from the agencies and audit committee members. Recommendation 3.1 on page 64 states the Denver Unauthorized Encampment Response Program should document its need, including a formal assessment of risks and stakeholder input to inform the draft program management plan. The city agreed with this recommendation and reported it had been implemented on June 1st, 2022. Recommendation 3.2 and 3.3 state the program should develop a timeline and performance metrics for all of its goals. The city agreed with these recommendations with an implementation date of October 31st, 2023. Recommendation 3.4 states the program should develop and document criteria for systematically determining how to prioritize encampment cleanups. The city agreed with this recommendation with an implementation date of December 31st, 2023. Recommendation 3.5 states the program should update its draft program management plan to identify all responsible parties, document policies and procedures for all agencies and teams involved in all encampment response efforts, and establish a process for ongoing program monitoring. Once the draft plan is revised, it should finalize the plan. The city agreed with this recommendation with an implementation date of December 31st, 2023. Recommendations 3.6 and 3.7 states the program should use quality data to monitor program effectiveness and progress towards meeting its defined goals and objectives. The program should revise the plan in line with leading practices and after reviewing the results of the program monitoring as necessary. The city agreed with these recommendations with an implementation date of December 31st, 2023. I would like to open the floor for questions or comments from the agencies and audit committee members.
Matthew?
I think I want to start with the first recommendation, please.
You bet.
And that's assessing the need for the program. I think this audit itself proves that there needs to be a formal and centralized organization of this response. And through all of this and through the data that has been gathered and what we experience day to day here as a city, the program is needed, a forum to make sure that everyone at the table is sitting at the table and making sure that we are taking an equitable and appropriate approach to not just our enforcement activities, our outreach activities, our support activities. And beyond just the anecdotal evidence of why this should exist, the mayor and the city leadership came together because of the need of this and came up with the plan to implement this program. We did take the stakeholder input. We did take input from the agencies, from people experiencing homelessness, from people with lived experience, from our outreach partners. And we not only just created this draft plan, which we do agree does continue to need to be added to and changed and edited to address the needs that we're talking about, but we did also evaluate risk and created a formal risk register that was provided to the auditor's office as well. And so while maybe not all of the processes that went into that were formally documented, the documents that were created itself show that the efforts were absolutely made to make sure that we determined the need for this program and to show why that need is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any comment on the other recommendations?
I think, as we were just saying, we agree. You know, this is a brand new program that is continuing to change and evolve to address a ever-changing and evolving situation. And we do understand that, policies and procedures need to be able to be monitored and addressed, and outcomes need to be determined as well. The program does have goals that don't have an end date. Those are going to be things like abiding by, law and ordinance. But there are ways that we can track, compliance of that. And so we do agree that we will make sure that we identify the proper goals, the proper metrics, and the reportable nature of those. And once again, NAVAP will really help make sure that we capture those things. As far as the things like criteria and weighting for the way that locations for cleanup are identified, once again, NAVAP is going to take all the criteria that we have that we spoke about here, formalize that within the program, the application itself, and then that will allow us to score these locations based on that risk, and we will be using that as a way to make sure that these locations are prioritized in an equitable fashion.
Thank you.
Thank you. On to finding 4, our last finding. Beginning on page 67, finding 4, the city's encampment response program may not be appropriately staffed to achieve its goals and responsibilities. While the draft unauthorized program management plan outlines agency responsibilities for responding to encampments, the mayor's office and unauthorized encampment response program coordinators did not conduct a formal analysis to identify staff needed to ensure the program goals are met. Managers said they may not have enough staff to meet goals and objectives because they may have underestimated the staff resources needed. At the same time, competing city priorities may lead to staff shortages. Managers also identified staff burnout, especially for overwhelmed cleanup staff, as a risk for increased staff turnover. Managers said reduced staff would have a significant impact on the program and its ability to deliver services. Affected departments, such as the Transportation and Infrastructure and Housing Stability, plan to increase their staff and provide mental health support to staff as needed. But without a complete workforce analysis, managers cannot ensure the city has adequate staff to achieve program objectives, to respond to encampments, provide services, and reduce the number of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. We have one recommendation for finding 4. Recommendation 4.1 on page 68 of the report states the Denver Unauthorized Encampment Response Program should conduct a formal staffing or workforce analysis to identify existing staffing levels and determine needs to meet program objectives and goals. The city agreed with this recommendation with an implementation date of December 31st, 2024. This concludes our presentation. We thank you for your time and would like to open the floor for any questions or comments from the agencies and audit committee members.
Matthew, you've agreed to the staffing analysis recommendation. Any further comment?
I think the only thing that I want to add is that as we look towards a new administration, there is the potential for the roles and responsibilities of all teams involved to change. And that depends on the priorities that are set forth of the future administration. So the workforce analysis will be heavily dependent on the roles and responsibilities that are identified as we move forward.
Is that why you have December 31st of 2024 as the goals? Because nearly 18 months, because you're not sure what's going to happen in the meantime?
That is correct.
Okay.
Jack?
Evan, you've been in the Hancock administration right from the beginning, if I'm not mistaken. And the whole issue, there's going to be a runoff election. We don't know who the next mayor is going to be. But this is obviously, at least from my perspective, one of the 4 or 5 major issues that the city's facing. Having been through the first cycle, the full cycle, what time would you recommend to the auditor's office in terms of following up this audit to see what's being done? Do you think January of 2024, given the dates, is appropriate? But you've got a pretty good sense of what transitions require, et cetera. And if you have a recommendation for us, we'd really appreciate hearing it.
It's a great point, and I'm a little surprised that it only came up here at the very end. I think we don't know what the future of this program will look like when the next administration takes office in 88 days and then gets up to speed and determines how or if even it wants to continue with the program or make any changes to it. So, and I think probably you're looking at a couple of years from today before a follow-up audit could have some depth to it or some meaning and some value.
I think you're talking about another audit like this, not just a follow-up on the recommendations. Is that correct?
Well, no, at this point, I mean a follow-up on the recommendations.
Okay.
Because, you know, obviously, there might be some other changes, but this is such a big issue to the city. Mm-hmm. It's not the kind of thing that you want to wait 2 years to kind of see what's happening. And your points are well taken. But I'm talking about just the follow-up on this, because there's this transition period, yeah. and you've been through one of these, so you know what this means, and we haven't. So that's why I'm asking you the question.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's my opinion. In some ways, I think that perhaps this audit would have benefited from having the new administration in place. I've said it a couple of times, but this program is so new and is in formation. I think it needs a little bit more time to mature.
Thank you.
And boy, this can be a guideline for the new administration.
Oh, I'm sure it will.
Exactly.
I have no doubt.
Well,
now, may I take a minute to thank the audit team?
Yeah, you bet.
This is the most complicated issue that this administration has dealt with, and no doubt will be the most complicated issue that the next administration will deal with. And it's not just an issue of unsheltered homelessness because of a housing crisis. It is more complicated because of a drug crisis, a mental health crisis, and the ongoing fallout from the pandemic. All of these things are woven together to make the challenges of trying to assist 1,313 people even more complicated. And Cars, you and your team did a great job of really trying to understand those complexities and how we as an administration attempt to go about them, addressing them on a day-to-day basis. I think it's important also to point out one of the things that Laura mentioned. Every night we shelter 2,000 people. Over the last 12 years, we have been able to provide housing to 15,000 people, and we've invested in 9,000 affordable housing units. That is the work that happens every day, and it happens quietly, and it happens behind the scenes. This work obviously happens under the glare of the spotlight, which adds another layer of complexity to it. But I just wanted to say thank you. I also want to thank the people in the administration who do this work every single day. It's hard. It's really difficult. But it means a lot, and people put their heart and soul into it because they know at the end of the day, if we can get one person into a better situation, then it was worth it. Thank you.
Thank you. That means a lot.
And thank you for all that you do, all of you for what you do, because I agree, Evan, this is the most complex problem we have in society today, and for all the reasons that you described. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, that concludes our briefing on the homeless encampments. We have Denver International Airport Great Hall construction. Why don't we take about a 2-minute at ease while we change players here?